The photograph sat in the mahogany box for 50 years, hidden beneath silk scarves and old letters that smelled of jasmine perfume and regret. Sonja Roi's hands trembled as she held it up to the light streaming through her Miami apartment window. August 14, 1964, her wedding day. She was 23 years old in that picture, wearing a cream-colored dress that cost more than her father made in a year, standing next to the most famous man in the world, Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., who would soon become Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion, the greatest boxer who ever lived. Everyone said they were the perfect couple, the golden boy and his beautiful bride. But if you looked closely at that photograph, really looked at Sonja's eyes, you could see something that no one wanted to see back then. Fear disguised as love, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a slight lean away from the man whose arm was wrapped possessively around her waist. "People ask me all the time about Muhammad," Sonja said, her voice carrying the weight of decades kept silent. She was 73 years old now, sitting in the small apartment she'd called home since 1986, far from the mansions and the fame and the violence that had defined her early 20s. "They want to hear the fairy tale, the champion and his queen, but I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of protecting a dead man's legacy while my truth stays buried." It was December 2019, and Sonja had finally agreed to tell her story to a documentary filmmaker who had been pursuing her for 3 years. The Me Too movement had changed something in the world, made space for stories like hers, stories that had been dismissed or ignored or actively suppressed for generations, stories about what happens behind closed doors when the cameras stop rolling and the crowds go home. But this story doesn't start with violence. It starts with magic. Miami, Florida, January 1964. Sonja was working as a cocktail waitress at the Sir John Hotel, a fancy establishment where celebrities and athletes stayed when they came to town. She was beautiful, everyone said so. High cheekbones, smooth dark skin, eyes that could stop a man mid-sentence. But beauty in 1964, for a black woman in the South, was both a gift and a curse. It opened some doors and slammed others shut with force that could break your fingers. Cassius Clay walked into the hotel lobby like he owned the building, the city, the entire world. And in a way he did. He was 22 years old and had just signed to fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship. The bout was scheduled for February 25th, just 6 weeks away, and Clay was in Miami for training camp. He was loud, brash, constantly declaring himself the greatest, even though he hadn't won the title yet. Most people thought he was crazy. Liston was going to destroy him. But when Cassius Clay looked at Sonja Roi, serving drinks in that hotel lobby, something shifted in his swagger. He actually got quiet for a moment, which his entourage later said was a miracle in itself. "What's your name?" he asked her, blocking her path as she tried to deliver martinis to a table of businessmen. "Sonja," she said, trying to step around him. She'd dealt with forward men before. It came with the job. "Sonja," he repeated, like he was tasting the word. "That's a queen's name. You know I'm going to be the heavyweight champion of the world in 6 weeks?" She'd heard this kind of talk before. Men making themselves bigger than they were, trying to impress her. "That's nice," she said politely. "Now if you'll excuse me, these drinks are getting warm." What happened next, Sonja would remember for the rest of her life, even when she wanted to forget. Clay didn't move. Instead, he did something unexpected. He got down on one knee, right there in the hotel lobby, in front of everyone. "I'm going to marry you," he said, completely serious. "I don't know when, but I'm going to marry you. You're going to be the wife of the greatest boxer who ever lived." People in the lobby laughed. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, shook his head and muttered something about Clay being distracted before the biggest fight of his life. But Sonja looked into those eyes, those impossible, confident, completely sincere eyes, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't just bravado. This man believed every word he was saying. "You don't even know me," Sonja said, but her voice had softened. "I know enough," Clay replied, standing up. "I know you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I know you carry yourself with dignity even though these people make you serve them drinks. I know you're stronger than you look, and I know that when I become champion, I want you by my side." It should have sounded ridiculous. It should have been the kind of line that made her roll her eyes and walk away. But there was something about Cassius Clay that made impossible things feel inevitable. 6 weeks later, he did exactly what he said he would do. He beat Sonny Liston. He became the heavyweight champion of the world, and he came back to the Sir John Hotel looking for Sonja. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Clay, who had now taken the name Muhammad Ali after joining the Nation of Islam, pursued Sonja with the same intensity he brought to boxing: flowers every day, phone calls that lasted hours, promises of a life beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Her parents were cautious, especially her father, who worked as a janitor and didn't trust fame or the people who had it. "Baby girl," her father said one night, 3 months into her relationship with Ali, "that man is going places you might not want to go. He's changing religions, making enemies, talking about refusing the draft. You sure you want to tie yourself to all that?" But Sonja was 23 and in love with the most exciting man in the world. "Daddy, he's not like other men. He has principles. He stands for something, and he loves me, really loves me." Her father didn't say what he was thinking, which was that love and principles could both be weapons in the wrong hands. They were married on August 14, 1964, in a private ceremony that made international news. The Nation of Islam leadership attended, which gave the wedding a political weight that made Sonja uncomfortable. She wasn't Muslim. She'd been raised Baptist. But Ali assured her that her beliefs were her own, that he would never force his faith on her. It was one of many promises that would later reveal themselves as carefully constructed lies. The first 8 months of marriage were exactly what Sonja had dreamed of. Ali was attentive, romantic, protective. He treated her like a queen, just as he'd promised. They traveled together, stayed in the best hotels, ate at restaurants where black couples had been turned away just years before. Ali's fame was a force field that bent reality around them. Racism couldn't touch them the same way it touched others. Poverty was a distant memory. The world, it seemed, was theirs, but there were signs. Small things that Sonja noticed but explained away because she wanted the dream to be real. Ali's temper, which flashed hot and cold without warning. The way he needed constant attention, constant validation. How he talked to her in public versus how he talked to her in private. In public, she was his queen. In private, she was increasingly just an accessory to his greatness, expected to exist in the background of his enormous ego. And then there was the control. Subtle at first, comments about what she wore, who she talked to, how she spent her time. "A champion's wife represents more than herself," he would say. "You have to be perfect, always." The first time it happened, it was April 9th. They'd been married 8 months. Ali had just successfully defended his title against Sonny Liston in their rematch, the fight that became famous for the phantom punch that knocked Liston out in the first round. They were staying at a hotel in Boston, celebrating with Ali's entourage, and Sonja had laughed at something one of his trainers said. It was an innocent laugh, the kind of polite response you give when someone tells a mildly amusing story. But when they got back to their hotel room, Ali's entire demeanor changed. He shut the door, locked it, and turned to face her with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, almost dead. "You think that's funny?" he asked quietly. "What?" Sonja was confused. "What are you talking about?" Laughing at what he said, giving him that smile, making me look like a fool in front of my own people. "Muhammad, I was just being polite. I didn't." The slap came so fast, she didn't see it. One moment she was trying to explain herself. The next moment she was on the floor, her cheek burning, her ear ringing, her mind trying to process what had just happened. Muhammad Ali, the man who had promised to protect her, who had gotten on his knee in a hotel lobby and declared his love, had just hit her. She looked up at him from the floor, shock and pain mixing into something she couldn't name. Ali stood over her, his hands still raised, his chest heaving. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then something in his face crumbled. He dropped to his knees beside her, tears suddenly streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "God, Sonja, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. The pressure, the fight, everyone wanting a piece of me. But that's no excuse. There's no excuse. Please, baby, please forgive me. It will never happen again. Never. He held her while he cried. And Sonja found herself comforting him, telling him it was okay, even though nothing was okay. This is what happens when you love someone more famous than God. You start to believe that your pain matters less than their pressure, that their violence is somehow your fault. It happened again 3 weeks later, and then again. And then it stopped being something she could count, because it became the rhythm of their marriage. Ali would explode over nothing. A meal that wasn't perfect, a phone call that lasted too long, the way she looked at another man, or the way she didn't look at Ali with enough adoration. And afterward, always, the apologies, the tears, the promises, the gifts, jewelry that felt like payment for bruises, vacations that felt like compensation for fear. Sonja learned to read his moods, to navigate around his anger like a sailor navigating around storms. She learned what to say, what not to say, how to make herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to his fragile ego, and she learned to hide it. The makeup that covered bruises, the sunglasses that hid swollen eyes, the careful lies to family and friends about why she couldn't visit, why she seemed so tired, why her laughter sounded forced. The Nation of Islam made it worse. They had rules about wives submitting to husbands, about not airing private business publicly, about protecting the image of their most famous convert. When Sonja tried to confide in one of the organization's counselors about Ali's violence, she was told that marriage was a test from Allah, that a good wife endures, that Ali's work was too important to be disrupted by domestic complaints. He's fighting for all of us, the counselor said. A middle-aged woman whose eyes were kind, but whose words were knives. He gave up millions of dollars refusing the draft. He's standing up to the government for his principles. Can't you stand by him through his struggles? So Sonja stood, and she endured, and she disappeared a little more each day. The worst incident came in 1966. Ali's boxing license had been stripped because of his refusal to fight in Vietnam. They were broke, living off loans and the charity of supporters. Ali was furious all the time, the rage of a man whose identity was tied to something that had been taken from him. Sonja was pregnant with their first child, 6 months along, her body changing in ways that made her feel vulnerable and exposed. They argued about money. Ali had spent what little they had on donations to the Nation of Islam, and Sonja had dared to suggest that maybe they needed to save something for the baby. His response was to grab her by the throat and slam her against the wall of their apartment. "Don't you ever question me," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his hand tight around her throat. "I'm Muhammad Ali. I don't take orders from anyone, especially not from my wife." Sonja couldn't breathe. She clawed at his hand, panic flooding her body. She was going to die. He was going to kill her and their unborn child over a financial disagreement. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Ali let go, stepped back, and walked out of the apartment without a word. Sonja collapsed to the floor, gasping, sobbing, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. She stayed there for hours, unable to move, unable to think, just feeling the baby kick inside her and wondering what kind of life she was bringing this child into. The baby, a daughter they named Miriam, was born in 19... Sonja hoped motherhood would change things, that seeing his child would soften Ali, would remind him that he had responsibilities beyond his image and his career. And for a few weeks it did. Ali was gentle with the baby, tender in ways Sonja hadn't seen since their courtship. But the violence didn't stop. It just became something that happened in between moments of tenderness. A thunderstorm that would roll through their lives without warning and then clear as if it had never happened. By 1968, Sonja knew she had to leave. But leaving Muhammad Ali wasn't like leaving a regular husband. He was the most famous athlete in the world, loved by millions, protected by powerful organizations, surrounded by people who would do anything for him, who would believe her if she told them, who would care about one woman's suffering when weighed against Ali's importance to the civil rights movement, to the anti-war movement, to black pride and Muslim identity. She gathered evidence quietly, photographs of bruises that she hid in her sister's house, a diary where she documented every incident with dates and details. recordings of Ali's apologies where he admitted what he'd done. She was building a case, preparing for a war she didn't want to fight, but knew she had to win if she was going to survive. The divorce filing in 1966 made headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. The media focused on Ali's infidelity, which was real and extensive. He'd been having affairs throughout their marriage, some with women who knew he was married, others with women he'd lied to about his marital status. But the abuse stayed hidden. Sonja's lawyers advised her not to mention it publicly. It will turn into a circus, they said. Ali's lawyers will destroy you. They'll say you're lying for money, they'll drag you through the mud, and even if people believe you, they won't care. He's Muhammad Ali, you're just his ex-wife. So Sonja took a settlement that included a strict non-disclosure agreement. She got some money, custody of their daughter, and a promise that Ali would stay away from her. In exchange, she promised never to speak publicly about the abuse, never to write about it, never to discuss it in interviews, never to do anything that might damage the legacy of the greatest. She kept that promise for 50 years. Now sitting in her Miami apartment in 2019, Sonja Roi finally broke her silence. People need to know the truth, she said to the documentary camera, her hands still trembling slightly when she talked about it. Not to destroy Muhammad's legacy, but to complete it, to show that heroes are complicated, that the same man who stood up to the government, who refused to fight in an unjust war, who inspired millions with his courage, that same man terrorized his wife behind closed doors. The filmmaker asked the question everyone would ask, why now? Why wait until Ali had been dead for 3 years to come forward? Sonja's answer was simple and devastating. Because I was afraid of him, even after he was dead. Afraid of his legend, afraid of his supporters, afraid that my truth would be dismissed, or weaponized, or used to hurt my daughter. But I'm 73 years old now. I don't have time to be afraid anymore. And there are women out there, right now, living with men who hit them, and then cry, and apologize, and promise to change. Women who think they can love someone into being better. Women who are ashamed to admit that their prince is actually a monster. Those women need to hear that it wasn't their fault, that leaving was the right choice, that surviving is a form of strength. The response to Sonja's confession was exactly what her lawyers had predicted decades earlier, a circus. Andy's supporters came out in force. They called her a liar, a gold digger, a bitter ex-wife, trying to tarnish a dead man's reputation for attention and money. They pointed out that she'd signed a non-disclosure agreement and had no right to break it now. They questioned why she'd waited so long, why she hadn't come forward when Andy was alive to defend himself. But something else happened too. Other women started coming forward. Women who had known Ali, who had seen his temper, who had been on the receiving end of his violence. His second wife, Khalila Ali, gave an interview confirming that abuse had been a pattern throughout Ali's relationships. His daughter Hannah wrote an essay about growing up in a house where love and violence were interchangeable, where you never knew which version of her father would come home. And thousands of women, who had never met Muhammad Ali, started sharing their own stories. Women who had stayed in abusive relationships because their partners were charismatic, successful, beloved by others. Women who had been told that their pain mattered less than their partner's reputation. Women who had lived in the shadow of someone else's greatness and forgotten how to cast their own light. The boxing world struggled with how to process this information. Muhammad Ali was more than a boxer. He was a symbol of resistance, of principle, of black excellence. Admitting that he had been abusive to his wives felt, to many, like admitting that the entire movement he represented was somehow tainted. But others argued that this was exactly the conversation that needed to happen, that heroes don't have to be perfect to be heroic, that acknowledging Ali's failures didn't erase his achievements, it made him human. Sonja herself tried to articulate this complexity. Muhammad did incredible things, she said in a follow-up interview 6 months after her documentary aired. He gave up everything for his principles. He inspired people all over the world. He fought racism and war and injustice. All of that is true, but it's also true that he hurt me, that he hurt other women, that his greatness didn't extend to how he treated the people who loved him most. Both things can be true at the same time. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I spent 50 years protecting his legacy. Now I'm trying to protect women who are living the life I lived. If my story saves even one woman from staying with a man who hits her because she thinks love is supposed to hurt, then breaking my silence was worth it." The legal battle over the non-disclosure agreement went on for 2 years. Ali's estate sued Sonja for breach of contract, seeking damages and trying to suppress the documentary. But public opinion had shifted. The Me Too movement had created space for these conversations. Judges were increasingly reluctant to enforce NDAs that protected abusers. In the end, a settlement was reached that allowed Sonja to keep speaking her truth while acknowledging that Ali's estate had legitimate grievances about the broken agreement. Sonja used part of her settlement to start a foundation for domestic violence survivors, specifically targeting women in relationships with powerful or famous partners. The foundation provided legal assistance, safe housing, and most importantly, a message that had taken Sonja half a century to fully believe. You are not crazy, you are not weak, and your suffering is not the price of someone else's greatness. On what would have been her 78th birthday, Sonja returned to the Sir John Hotel in Miami. It was still there, though barely recognizable. The grand lobby where Cassius Clay had gotten on his knee and promised her the world had been renovated multiple times. The cocktail station where she'd worked no longer existed, but she stood there anyway, in the space where her life had changed forever, and thought about the 23-year-old girl who had believed in fairy tales. "I don't regret loving him," Sonja said, speaking to a small group of women from her foundation who had accompanied her on this pilgrimage. "I regret staying when love turned to violence. I regret believing his apologies more than I believed my own pain. I regret teaching my daughter that this was what marriage looked like. But I don't regret the love itself. We're allowed to love people who hurt us. We're just not required to keep letting them do it." One of the younger women, a 26-year-old who had left her abusive partner 3 months earlier, asked Sonja if she ever forgave Muhammad Ali. Sonja thought about this for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness is complicated," she finally said. "I've forgiven him for being broken, for being a product of a world that taught men that dominance equals strength. But I haven't forgiven the system that protected him. I haven't forgiven the people who knew what he was doing and looked the other way, because his work was too important. I haven't forgiven the culture that told me my suffering didn't matter." She smiled sadly. Muhammad Ali was the greatest boxer who ever lived. But he was also a man who hit women. Both of those truths exist together. And maybe that's the real lesson, that we can acknowledge someone's greatness while also holding them accountable for their failures. That we can learn from their achievements while refusing to excuse their violence. That's how we honor the full truth of people's lives, not just the parts that make good stories. The documentary, titled Behind the Greatest Sonja's Truth, premiered in It won awards. It sparked debates. It made people uncomfortable. But most importantly, it reached women who needed to hear Sonja's message. In the 2 years following its release, calls to domestic violence hotlines increased by 40% in some regions. Women cited the documentary as the catalyst that helped them leave abusive relationships. Sonja's foundation grew from a small local operation to a national organization. And in boxing gyms around the world, trainers started having different conversations with their young fighters. Conversations about what real strength looks like, about how the discipline and control required in the ring should extend to how you treat the people you love, about how being the greatest means being great in all aspects of your life, not just the ones that get you trophies. Muhammad Ali's legacy remains complicated, as all legacies ultimately are. He's still the heavyweight champion who stood on principle, still the man who gave up everything to fight for what he believed in, still an inspiration to millions. But he's also now a cautionary tale about the cost of unchecked ego, about what happens when we protect powerful men at the expense of vulnerable women, about how even our heroes are human and must be held accountable for their humanity. Sonja Roi died peacefully in her sleep in 2024 at the age of 83. Her daughter Miriam was by her side. At her memorial service, women filled the small church, women Sonja had helped, women she'd inspired, women who had found the courage to leave because she had found the courage to speak. They shared stories of her kindness, her strength, her refusal to let anyone silence her ever again, after those 50 years of imposed silence. On her gravestone, at Sonja's request, were carved just 5 words. She told the truth, finally. And in Miami, at the Sir John Hotel, that had been converted into a community center, there now hangs a photograph. Not the wedding photo that had been hidden for so long, but a recent picture of Sonja, taken just months before her death. She's smiling in it, a real smile that reaches her eyes, and beneath it, a plaque reads, "For every woman who stayed too long, and every woman who found the strength to leave, your pain matters, your truth matters, you matter." That's Sonja Roi's legacy. Not as Muhammad Ali's first wife, not as the woman the greatest hurt, but as the woman who survived, who spoke, who saved others by refusing to protect the reputation of a man who hadn't protected her. Because sometimes the greatest courage isn't in the ring. It's in the quiet decision to value your own life enough to walk away from someone everyone else loves. It's in the decades-long choice to finally tell the truth